Welcome everybody to our Sound for Video session. It's good to be here. This one's gonna be chill. We've done a lot in the last 48 hours, including biffing a live stream over on the main channel pretty badly. That was my fault, not Emma's fault. And I'm actually trying to get some things set up here now. Actually, okay, there we go. Things are looking better. So probably our big topic for tonight is going to be Izotope RX8, which was released earlier this week. So in any case, let's jump over into our agenda and see what we've got going here for today. So not a lot. We've got Izotope RX8 and we've got a question and answer session. So we had a few questions that were submitted ahead of time. Now, just a little note here. We did get some questions in relation to recording instruments and mixing instruments, and I am not an expert in that area. Don't have a whole lot of experience, not nearly as much as I would like to be able, and certainly not enough, I don't feel like, to answer some of those questions. They're great questions. So what we'll be doing is I am working to bring on a guest to help us out with some of those questions, and it'll be the next few days here while we're working through those details. So stick with us there. For those that did submit the questions in relation to recording instruments and mixing, we will get to them, but just not this week. So more to come on that. All right, let's go ahead and go through the questions first because some of them relate to RX8. So, and then we'll do the RX8, do a little bit of a demo at the end here. So let's go ahead and jump to our questions. So first of all, from Jeff, this is probably not an issue big enough to cover, but I have a MixPre 3.2 and MixPre 10.2, and I have never been able to set either up with the ASIO driver. Sound Devices tends to just tell me they only have Macs, so they cannot test anything for me, so I was hoping you might actually know how to set up the MixPre as an interface to actually work with ASIO and multitrack. I am so sorry, Jeff. I don't have a Mac either. However, I did install I don't have a Windows machine either, but I did install Windows 10 on my MacBook a couple of weeks ago. So I have not had an opportunity to go set that up, but I will go make an effort at that and see how far we get, and we'll have to come back to your question. So I'll go ahead and file that away. Apologize, I don't have the answers for you up front. If anyone in the chat here knows about setting up a MixPre using the ASIO drivers from Sound Devices, and you have anything you could share, by all means, definitely do that to help out our friend Jeff here. Okay. Next up from Boca, which is the preferred placement of shotgun microphones, rotating the grill vertically facing the openings up and down or horizontally side to side? We use a Rode NTG3. As strange as it sounds, I think that actually it doesn't generally matter. In the tests that I've done, I haven't noticed a difference, and I think the design is really made so that it can manage basically the interference tube allows it to kind of manage noise from basically all sides. There's not a huge null as far as I've been able to tell, but if anyone knows more about microphone design than certainly than I do, which is not a stretch, and you know better, I've never really spent a lot of time kind of tweaking where I put the interference tube in terms of all the the slits on the side of the shotgun microphone. So I haven't noticed a huge difference. So I guess that's about all I know, really, Boca, on that. And if you start to notice something, definitely let us know. But my sense has been it doesn't seem to make a huge difference with most designs, like most decent microphone designs, at least. So thanks for the question. All right, from Thomas. As part of the update for Izotope RX8, they have improved their loudness control module. Is this something that can be used with DaVinci Fairlight as a plugin? Let's actually switch over to the other computer here. Let's switch over here to DaVinci Resolve. So, and actually, let's go ahead and open up RX8. There it is. So I'm going to open up the RX8 audio editor. This just came out this week here. I just installed it on this laptop here. So it's going to ask me all the startup kind of things here. That's fine. You can access my documents folder. Okay, here is RX8. All right. So a couple of things that are kind of interesting. So first of all, the loudness module, which is actually down here, loudness control. Oops, there it is. we'll come back to this and look at it in a little bit more detail, but this is actually only available in the RX audio editor. It is not available as a standalone plugin. And the reason for that is that it processes offline. And so not all of the digital audio workstations can support that. So for example, in DaVinci Resolve, if we come over into DaVinci Resolve, we're going to have to click on it over here. Fine. Okay. If I come over into the Fairlight panel, and I don't have anything loaded in this project, so let's just come over here and load something in. Okay, drop that in. Let's see, let's get our media pool. We'll drop this in. Whoops. Okay. Now, if I come over here to add an effect, you'll notice if I come to other, whoops, nope. Here we go. RX, you'll notice that RX loudness control is not an option here. So it's not something we can do here. Unfortunately, you do have to go over to the RX audio editor. And in fact, Thomas, we'll show you in just a minute here. We have another question about this as well, in fact. I'll show you how to set that up to do the round trip for getting it out of Fairlight over into the audio editor, RX audio editor, and then bringing that back in here. So we'll cover that in just a minute. So let's switch back over to our questions here. All right. Next up from David, how do you remove or reduce reverb in DaVinci Resolve 16? Okay, that's not a simple question. You can do a little bit of EQ. So if you're in a room where there's a lot of high frequency content, you can just use a high, or I guess it would be a low pass filter to cut off some of the high frequencies. There are definitely some options there, but you don't, it's not the most effective way of doing that. If you have RX, that is probably the best way to do it. I'm not sure of any other really great way to do it in DaVinci Resolve with the included plugins, unfortunately. You can add reverb, but removing reverb is not something that it ships with as far as I'm aware. So definitely something, you can use a little bit of denoising that, that's not really going to attack reverb necessarily. It might help a little bit, but it's really not set up to do that on its own. You really have to go into something like RX, or if you, there are some other de-reverb. I know that, what is the name of the company? There's another company that creates a de-reverb plugin that's standalone. It's decent. De-reverb is a tricky one because the plugins that I've used, they're helpful, but they're not going to remove reverb. So you have to kind of get out of the mindset of thinking that it's going to remove reverb. It's really just going to help reduce it a little bit so that it's not quite as distracting for your audience. So if you really don't want reverb, you need to treat it during the time of recording. You need to treat the room and manage it there. But we do have over here in RX, for example, we do have, I can show you over here, there is the de-reverb. Here it is. So we now have a dialogue de-reverb right here. Pretty simple and straightforward. I'm not really set up to demonstrate it right now, but this would be my suggestion. There is, if you do a search for reverb, Curtis Judd reverb on YouTube, you will find some videos where we do give an example. So David, I would definitely recommend you go take a look at those and listen to those. Just kind of see what your options are out there. Yeah, so let's leave it at that for that question. Appreciate the question there. All right, next up from Clayton, can you show how to round trip DaVinci Fairlight to an external audio editor? I asked because I tried and I can't get it to do that with DaVinci and Audition with no success. I'm not really clear, Clayton, if you're trying to go from DaVinci to Audition or if you're trying to... I can show you how to do it to Izotope, for example. Let's just go and run through that. So if we can switch over here to this computer, we're going to go into Resolve here. If we go up into our preferences, All right. Here, if we go to the Audio Plugins tab, so we're on the System tab, and we're going to go to Audio Plugins. Down here, we have a Setup External Audio Processes. So I can go ahead and click Add. And this is going to be set on Command Line. And then what I'm going to do is click over here, and we're going to choose, this will be RX8. Okay, I double click there in the path. It's asking for permissions to go to all these different places. Whoops. What happened to my window there? Okay, so we've lost window here. It's somewhere around here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and force quit that. I don't know what happened there. And we're going to come back in. Okay, back into Resolve. Give me just a moment here. So this is about how my last 24 or 48 hours has gone. It's been a little rough, but we'll get where we need to go. Thanks for sticking there with us. All right, we're going to open up this untitled project, back up into File, back up into DaVinci Resolve, Preferences, Audio Plugins, Add. All right, you just tap once in Path, and then what you do here is just navigate to the application. So I'm going to go to Applications, and we are going to find Izotope RX here. RX8 Audio Editor, click Open. I can change the name of it here. I'm just going to call this RX8. Okay, we'll save that. It says our preferences have been updated and they will become active next time we start Resolve. So we're going to go ahead and quit Resolve. And we will come back in. On this poor little laptop is huffing and puffing right now. I don't know if you can hear that fan. All right, come back in here. In our media pool, we're going to go ahead and drop a clip in here just so that we have that. Users, Curtis, desktop. Let's get this file, Fairlight. We'll show our media pool, drop this file in. Okay, now if I wanted to work on this particular file and round trip it to RX, what I would do is I can just right click on it, external audio process, and choose RX8. So it's bouncing the clip, and it opened it up over here in RX. And Resolve quit unexpectedly. I'm sorry, that's not funny. We're going to go ahead and ignore that for now. So normally it doesn't do that, but evidently now it does. Although, oh, that was an old message. Actually, this version of our Resolve is still running, so we're actually good. Okay. So let me just do a demonstration while we're here. We'll run through this and give you a sense for how we can do things here. What I need to do is I need to actually play this back, but we need to get on our faders over here and just make sure that this doesn't play back too loudly. So let's go ahead and turn on audio for camera 2. And let's pull that fader down a bit. Maybe go to -20. And I'm going to play back here and see what we get. One thing that's really kind of cool about the Godox lights is they put,
Okay, let's go back up
company
then.
that makes photographic lighting equipment as well. They put this little, you can't see it very
Cool. All right, so now we can do a demonstration here. So let me just kind of run through what I would typically do for, and this is going to be kind of more of a general, and we'll take a look specifically at the loudness control, because I think that was one of the things that we saw a question about earlier. and kind of how I would approach this generally in terms of processing a clip like this. So the first thing I would do is I actually see that we have, let's see, how do I do it with the touchpad? There we go. So I have these things here that are kind of, sticking way out above everything else. I'm just going to go ahead and grab the gain module here, and we're going to drop that down some. So I'm going to set that to -3. This is just a way you can, put a targeted processing just to kind of bring something down right there. That's one way to do it. There are a number of ways to do it, but that's one of the ways. And actually, one of the things that's kind of nice about RX8 that the older versions didn't have too is you can now scroll back and forth. So with the like with 2 fingers on the touchpad, so that's pretty nice. So here's some other things that stick out too. If I play those, you'll hear that those are. This was a demonstration I did for the live stream I did yesterday. So that it's actually when I'm taking like a Bowens mount thing off of a light, and we get kind of this clicking noise. And then, so that's when I'm taking the reflector off, and this is when I'm opening up an umbrella. So let me just process those as well. I'm just getting my headphones here. Okay. And it's really disorienting to hear myself with latency. But, whoops. So let's just play some of that for you. What I'm going to do is, so you hear that was again, that reflector coming off the light. Might just drop that maybe by 6 dB. So it's not sticking out so much. That as well. What I'm going to do is, okay, just so that we don't have these massive transients to fight with. Here's the umbrella. Open up this umbrella. Okay, cool. So there's that. Let's come over here into the spectral view. Pull up my EQ. Usually going to use a high pass just to roll off some of this material down here. And the headphones are a little too distracting, so we're taking those off. Okay, what else do we need to address here? We did have some fan noise, and you can see that represented as these different bands here. I don't know that we're going to worry too much about that, but let me just do the high pass here. And what I want to do is run through some of my dialogue here and see if I need to kind of remove any nasty resonances. So let's try that first. So what I'm going to do is, let's get band number 3 here. I'm going to boost it by 9 dB, narrow the Q. Okay, while we're playing, I'm going to sweep. Cool about the Godox lights is they put, because they're a company that makes photographic lighting equipment as well, they put this little, you can't see it very well here, but I'll show it in the close-up. There's this little holder for an umbrella, and an umbrella can produce some beautiful soft lights. So for example, right now I have the reflector on. You can see we create these hard shadows, especially if I get farther away. See how it's getting more and more defined, that shadow. Now, if I pop off that reflector and put on the umbrella, we can get a much softer light. So what I'm going to do is just pop that off. Let's open up this umbrella. Pop that on. Now you can't see a thing on the wall, so I'm going to move this over a little bit. You can see we're getting a much softer light, so we're not getting the shadows anymore that we were getting before, the hard shadows. And obviously it cuts a lot of the light, but it does soften things up very nicely. And in addition to that, one thing that's important to keep in mind, I love umbrellas. They can produce a... Okay, that's helping with some of those kind of mid-tone frequencies or resonances in my voice, so that kind of smooths it out a little bit. So I'll go ahead and render that out. All right. Pop back over. Okay, the next thing I'm generally going to do is buy myself a little bit of headroom. You'll notice that this waveform is asymmetric, so we've got more on the rarefaction side down here, it looks like, than we do above. So I'm going to pull out my phase module here. Just click in the adaptive phase rotation and render that out. You'll see when we look at the waveform here, we'll even up, and that will help us as far as our overall. Yeah, see now it looks very much centered. And let me just actually undo that. I want to show you something that goes along with that. So I'm going to open up loudness control. Can these be resized? Because those look tiny. Oh yeah, it can be resized, and it actually shows a couple of things that can be useful. Right now, so the integrated loudness of this entire clip right here is sitting at -33, so it's pretty quiet. And our true peak is at -10.9 dB. So watch what happens when I run the phase here. We may see a difference here in the true peak. Let's go ahead and run that again. Okay, looks like we got basically another 2 dB of headroom, so that was definitely worthwhile for us. Okay, so there are a couple things here in the loudness control which is interesting. You now have these presets here. So instead of just the different loudness standards, you also have a few new ones here. You'll see, for example, we have podcast delivery. When I set it to that, you can see what it does is it sets, well, it may be hard to see, it's really small, but the integrated loudness target becomes -16, and the true peak becomes -1. If I change it to music streaming playback check, it changes the loudness target to -14 LUFS and a true peak of -1. This one was interesting when I looked at it. Contemporary Music Master, watch this. Integrated loudness target -10. Or in other words, leave absolutely no dynamic range so that I can have really loud music. And then the true peak is at -0.3. I wouldn't recommend using that, even if you are producing music. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the super compression. I mean, obviously, if you're making a pop song, you do have to compress it, but sometimes I feel like it's been pushed way too far. But we do have, oh, here's actually video streaming. That also says -14, which is not necessarily what I would recommend. Again, YouTube does seem to hold -14 LUFS as a target for loudness. But what's interesting about these drop-downs here is you'll notice we're just working with a mono file here. I just have a single channel. The thing is all these targets really apply to stereo. So, you have to kind of take that into account here. So, for example, if you're doing something mono and you are eventually going to go to a -16, is going to be your delivery, you're going to back off by 3 dB and go to -19 for a mono. And then you can change it to dual mono when you get back into your digital audio workstation. So just something to keep in mind there. The other thing that's new here is this short-term loudness. So you can also take action on the short-term loudness levels, and it will do some limiting for you as well. So basically this becomes a limiter, and it will, whatever you set that short-term loudness to, it will kind of manage those levels as well. I don't generally worry about that too much. If you're going to web, again, usually it's the integrated loudness that you're more interested in. And the true peak ceiling here will also, it'll catch anything that's going to clip before it clips. And then there's also this, this was already there before, but the tolerance, the loudness units, depending on which of these you choose, it will set that for you. So for example, the ITU BS 1770, let's go to the most recent one, it has a loudness units tolerance level of 2.0, so 2 loudness units. And it's targeting -24. Again, that's going to be for stereo. Pardon me, or dual mono. So those are kind of the differences there, but let me just show you something here that's kind of interesting. So if I bump this up and say, okay, I want to go to, let's say I'm going to go -19 here because I'm going to web. And let's give myself, let's say, true peak ceiling of -1.5. Let's go ahead and process that and watch what happens to this waveform. Just so you're aware. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that for a minute. You can see it's basically chopped some of this off. So it's just applying a limiter, a true peak limiter. So you probably still want to do your compression beforehand and kind of manage those in a little bit more of a natural way in as much as possible. So I'll come back in here to our loudness control, and we'll also pull up our compressor. Let's go to our plugin. Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to choose my plugins again. So we're gonna get the oh, sadly, I don't have my compressor installed here that I normally use. So well, unfortunate. Okay. So we won't do that for today, but normally I would do a little bit of compression, and I want to talk about that a little bit. If you think about the ways that kind of classic compressors work, the older analog compressors, the thing that's interesting about those is they generally sound very transparent. It doesn't sound obviously compressed a lot of times. Depending on how you apply it, it's just really super transparent and it sounds good, but yet it manages your, the transients, the things that are sticking way up in terms of amplitude that are kind of preventing you from pushing your overall loudness higher. And I think one of the reasons that they sound that way is that they're not using as an aggressive an attack as a limiter typically does. So they're letting some of that transient make its way through before it kind of kicks in gently and has a more gentle kind of flowing effect to it that's a little bit more transparent. And so when I do what I've been doing a lot more recently with dialogue audio, when I do compress it, I'm using an attack somewhere in the maybe a 7 milliseconds range. And that seems to be a lot more transparent than if you just cram it right down to, like 0 milliseconds or 1 millisecond or whatever the minimum setting is for that particular compressor that you're using. So there's a little something to experiment with if you're feeling like your compression is sounding really kind of harsh and making the voice just a little too much. So there's something to consider and to do. So once I've done that, then I would apply the loudness, do the loudness normalization. You saw what we did with compression. If I needed to do, actually, and Greg brings up a good point here. Go ahead and let's switch back over to this. Here, I'm going to go ahead and bump this up. Let's open up our loudness control. Let's go, for now, let's just go -23. One thing you'll find with lavalier microphones, and this was a lavalier microphone mounted on the chest, you'll see things like this right here. Those are heartbeats. And so Greg's asking, what are your tips for, managing that? And I think basically is attenuating, is just coming in and, you can automate it. Depending on how you like to work, you can automate it. You can probably do something, even in RX, you can do it in a kind of more graceful way than I've been doing here with the gain control. There is a way, I don't do this a whole lot in RX, but there is a way, for example, you can show your clip gain, and you can actually just draw dots on here and pull some of that down just like that. So, however it makes sense for you. And I think it actually updates the waveform is actually updating in real time. So you can actually see the effect it's having, and of course you can hear it as well. But that'll help you to kind of make a smoother transition if you want to do something like that. I don't have any other secrets beyond that in terms of managing those heartbeats. But that is one way to approach it, just like that. Okay. Once we have done all that, let me see, what else would we do? We could also do, one of the things that's nice in RX as well, for those that are not familiar with it, there's of course this voice denoise, and this works very nicely. But what I find works really, really well as well, there's a lot of wells in there, as wells. There's also a dialogue isolate. This one is definitely worth having a look at next time you're doing any sort of denoising. This one does a really nice job of identifying what's dialogue and identifying what is the ambient sound, and kind of basically separating them and allowing you to kind of basically isolate them one from another and control them independently. So for a lot of narrative film, for example, you may not want to eliminate all of the ambient sound entirely, but this is a good way to be able to control some of that and kind of have an ability to fine-tune that without getting this kind of, artificially clean sounding kind of recording accidentally, like often happens if you go too hard with like a voice denoise. Different tools, they can each be appropriate depending on the circumstances, but definitely give this one a consider as well. And maybe we'll go into more detail in a future episode here. I don't have a super noisy recording here, so I don't know that that's going to do a lot for us here. But another thing that people have asked a lot about is, what about order of operations? And I actually find that a lot of this, the way that Izotope is laid out, actually is not a bad way to approach overall order of operations. So like if you're cleaning things up, I would basically start at the top and work your way down. Now, a lot of times what I will do is, I will come down and do an EQ first, and just like we showed before, I will do a high pass filter here just to filter out any things I know I'm not going to need down on the bottom end. And I'll take care of any resonances first. Then once I've done that, I'll come back and do these other cleanup things. So for example, if I wanted to, well, it's not entirely true. I actually come back and do breath control. That's usually one of the last things I do. So even after I loudness normalize, I'll come back in and do my breath control then. And breath control is really simple. All it does is it's basically just looking for the breaths. I think it works kind of like a gate, but it also, I believe, takes into account the frequency of the breath sounds. And so it's looking for some of that as well. And so you can do it a couple of different ways. You can do a gain setting here. So this is telling it how much to reduce the gain. So once it does find a breath here, for example, I might reduce it by somewhere between 4, maybe 6 if I want to be a little bit more aggressive. And then there's also a target mode. And target mode, instead of reducing by a set amount, the target is where it's going to try and put the breaths in terms of amplitude. So it'll push them down to this level is the main idea. And then the sensitivity is just to basically tell it how to find, I guess, how hard to try to find the breaths. And you'll just need to use your ear to kind of tweak that back and forth. It's always good to go ahead and put your playhead on, start previewing, and start listening. Softer light, so we're not getting the shadows anymore that we were getting before, the hard shadows. And obviously it cuts a lot of the light, but okay, so you could see how that was working there. So it shows you how much attenuation it's doing. And so those are two different modes you can work in. A lot of times I'll go to the gain mode and just say -4 or -6, but you can also go to target mode too if you're more comfortable with that approach. And actually that's for reasons, I don't know if I have a really strong logical reason for why I do that last, but I think that the detection algorithm seems to work better once I've boosted it up. Maybe I'm wrong on that. That was just from some early experimenting I did with it. So that I'll usually do after I do my loudness normalization with the loudness control module right here. All right, so I've blathered on for a while. Let's go ahead and switch back here. And we had some interesting things happen from a technology standpoint. We are using the Blackmagic ATEM Mini Pro ISO. And we were kind of going back and forth. I wanted to be able to share my screen here to show you Izotope tonight. And we kind of struggled with figuring out the best way to do that. I have a couple of different computers and we have to figure out which computer we want to put it on. And, we've got one computer that's typically, kind of like the control computer that we don't show in the live stream. It's just at the YouTube studio so we can see the chat and control the chat. And then we put the comments on screen using Aaron Parecki's little JavaScript. And so we had some problems tonight where we were going to use Ecamm Live tonight instead of the JavaScript that we typically use. We prefer the JavaScript, but just in terms of how we were going to share the screen, it wasn't working out. And so we went to go try using Ecamm, and Ecamm couldn't recognize the ATEM Mini Pro ISO for reasons I do not understand. So anyway, we ended up falling back. We're actually streaming from the A10 Mini Pro ISO directly to YouTube, and we have no ability to put chat comments on the screen tonight. And so we feel like a little bit, it's almost like feeling like you're a little bit naked and giving a presentation. It's we've gotten so used to having those. So, and anyway, we're gonna do our best here to answer questions, although we won't be able to put them on screen. So let's see what we've got here for us tonight. Okay, here's one from what's that? Oh, please explain amplitude. The amplitude stat in Audition, and why does Audition record any bit depth, 32-bit, and any sample rate, even though the audio interface is limited to certain like 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz? Okay, that's a good question. Let's go ahead and let's swap on over into Audition, and I'll show you what I can here. Let's go ahead and switch to number 2 here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up a file here just so we have something to work with. Okay, that's the same file we were looking at before. So first of all, let me actually talk about your last question first. So your question was, why does it record in 32-bit, 48 kilohertz by default, even when your audio interface is limited? So that's a good question. I don't know why they've set that as the default, but what it's doing essentially is it's just translating that. So if your audio interface, for example, is delivering 44.1 kilohertz or whatever, 16-bit or 24-bit, it's just translating that into a 32-bit space, addressing space. So it's not actually, you're still limited by what the audio interface is feeding into Audition. So it's not like you're suddenly getting a 32-bit float, wide dynamic range, multiple analog to digital converters kind of recording. It's just putting it in a 32-bit address space. So there's no difference there as far as I'm aware, but it's a good question, so I appreciate that. Next up, as far as amplitude statistics, I think you were asking about, please explain amplitude statistics. Let's do that. Okay, so I'm going to come over here into amplitude statistics. If you don't have that on your screen, you come into Window and make sure there's a check mark next to amplitude statistics. We can go ahead and we've highlighted just this portion of the audio clip, so it'll just measure that. All right, and then it brings up a number of different things here. Let's see if we can. I can change the zoom. Well, not that way. I'm trying to zoom in on the UI, and I don't see a way to do that. Okay, well, I'll do my best here to describe this. So first of all, we have our peak amplitude, and what that means, a peak amplitude is simply, it's actually this right here. It is the highest amplitude peak in the sample that you just measured. So this one right here, for example, it's measuring at minus 5.74 dB, and that's basically what we see right here. Okay, the next is the true peak amplitude, and you'll notice that's at minus 3.66, so it's not the same. Now, what true peak does, and let's see if we can actually find this here, find an example here. We may be able to. I'm going to zoom in here. Ah, here's a perfect example. This is a perfect, wow, I got super lucky. So here's the thing. So in digital audio, each dot here that's represented on the screen is a sample. But in reality, in the real world, the audio wave will actually extend beyond the samples to a different equivalent amplitude. So here's an example between two different samples. While the tallest sample is actually minus 5.74, the waveform would actually, if it interpolates all this, would actually go all the way up to minus 3.66 dB. And that's what the dB true peak is measuring. So there's no actual sample here. There's no digital encoded piece of information in the audio file right here. But in reality, on playback, it will actually go up that high. And so that's what the dB true peak amplitude represents. And that's from my point of view, this is the most important one to keep in mind in digital audio, is because this is going to be closest to reality when it comes time to play something back or to convert it from digital back to analog, so on and so forth. So, or even to go from analog to digital, the system has to be able to handle that in some fashion. So that's what the dB true peak is. Maximum sample value. I never use these, and so I'm not really sure what those are. minimum sample value. Here it identifies how many potentially clipped samples you have, so anything that might be hitting up against 0 dB up here that could be clipped. Total RMS amplitude. So RMS stands for root mean square. It's basically a way of averaging over time. And so it's a little bit like giving you a sense for, well, actually, let's just show you. Here's a histogram here. So if you look at this histogram here, this is showing you where most of your energy, or how much, where your audio clip is in terms of amplitude throughout that part that we measured. And you can see that the majority of it is sitting somewhere around minus 32 dB. But this is averaging it basically over time. And you can identify how you want it to do that calculation. So typically I would just leave it at its default here. There's also the maximum RMS, minimum RMS. These are basically statistics that tell you, kind of give you an idea with single numbers about what the, how loud this audio is overall. And before we had a lot of these other more sophisticated measures like LUFS or LKFS, a lot of it we had to really rely on these RMS figures here. So here you can see our LUFS figure is minus 32. That's really pretty close to our total RMS value as well. In this case, we got lucky. Now, if we were to measure a larger portion here, like if I measured this portion, what we might see, we come in at minus 34 LUFS, and the RMS is actually minus 37. So you can see RMS is going to be more influenced by quieter portions of the audio than LUFS is. Basically, LUFS, when it gets below a certain point, it kind of ends up weighting it less in the overall measurement. So this is saying, LUFS is saying this is actually louder than what RMS is saying. And RMS is just kind of a dumb measure. It just averages everything together. I like to use these. So for example, when we do our noise sample in our various microphone reviews and audio recorder reviews, I like to use this to measure the kind of the noise floor, just to see where things are sitting, just at a practical level. Because the nice thing about that is this represents pretty nicely. If you're just measuring a portion of, and I put this in air quotes, silence, this does a pretty good job of giving you a sense for where it sits and how much of it you'll be able to hear. DC offset is when your waveform does not center around the minus infinity line. That is called DC offset. And that's usually like a technical problem with your recording equipment. This one doesn't measure that. The waveforms are asymmetric, but they are sitting around, like when it goes to silence, it is sitting right around the minus infinity line. If you were to go to silence and it was sitting below or above the minus infinity line, that's when you have a DC offset issue. And you can actually correct that pretty effectively here. I don't remember where it was in here. Thought it was under amplitude and compression, and I think maybe they have put it into the normalize. Yeah, you can offset the DC bias right here. So if you do have a DC offset, you can fix it with that little plugin there. Here the bit depth is just saying 24. It's giving you measurements of dynamic range. And here's sort of a legacy measurement of loudness, which is kind of like LUFS. But it was another way of calculating those numbers. So there is a look at the amplitude statistics module in Audition. I hope that was helpful. All right. Roland, I'm thinking of moving to mic to MixPre 2 with noise assist to an art voice channel strip back to MixPre. Does this make sense? Anything to watch out for in this setup? I'm not sure, Roland. I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish there. I would probably generally try to keep the signal chain a little simpler than that if you can. I don't know, or maybe if you're trying to impart some of that tube magic. If so, I would just probably put that in front of your MixPre as opposed to routing it, in and out and then back in. So, some thoughts there. Okay, we're looking for our next question here. Roland mentions that Izotope has a really super D reverb function, and I agree. It's probably one of the better ones I've used. So if you do need to de-reverb, that's one way to do it. Is it true that RX is not officially supported by Final Cut Pro 10? Oh, I don't know. Let's open up here and see what we get. No, that's not true. Actually, I just used it within the last couple days. It might not officially be supported, but it works. All of the plugins that are available through normal most other DAWs, digital audio workstations, also work in Final Cut Pro 10. I use the declick quite a lot. So if I have a mouth click that I missed when I was processing my dialogue before I came into Final Cut, and there's a long story about, for YouTube videos at least, I typically process the audio first because it's not like a scripted narrative film where you have 15 different takes for the same scene and you're not sure which one you're going to use yet. So you typically want to do the edit first and then come back and do the mix on your audio and your dialogue edit and all of that. But on my YouTube videos, typically I have like one main storyline, and so I know which take I'm going to use already up front. So it's not usually a problem. In fact, if we switch over here to show you our screen, if I come over here into our plugins, come down to audio, go to Izotope, and you can see that our RX8 plugins are right there. So, and I've confirmed they work. I've actually used the declick quite a lot, just right here from Final Cut. So hopefully that helps there. All right, next up from Greg. Have you used audio limited A10s for wireless booming? Any issues or things to know? I have not. So Greg, I just now got my second audio limited receiver. So I now have 4 channels of audio limited, and I got the SL2 to put it in my bag with my 888. So I've got everything integrated there. Next step is to put the boom on an A10 transmitter. A good person to talk to, if you haven't already, is Alan Williams over at the Sound Speeds channel. He booms with an audio limited transmitter all the time. And there is something that he mentioned some issues with filtering, and he has to do something with the antenna. And I haven't come across that yet myself, so I still have those lessons to learn, and I'll probably talk to Alan about that. Once I find out about that, though, I can report back and let you know what I know there. All right. You did a nice range test with the Sony wireless in open space. Have you done the same thing with the A10s? How does the range compare? Let's see, Sony wireless. I'm trying to think back. When was that? When would that have been? I did the range test with the Shure just this last week. I have done it with the A10 as well. It does a great job. It has even higher output capabilities. I believe it goes up to 50 milliwatts. I have had dropouts with my A10 system, just to be clear. So there was one shoot we were doing, and just out of curiosity, one of the talent walked off set for a little bit. They actually ended up going inside of a brick building, and it dropped. Once they got deep enough into the building, I was outside. So there was that, and then they also walked around the brick building to go over to the craft table at one point. And when they walked around the building, I dropped the signal there too. That I think you're going to see with most wireless systems. And this was just with the plain old included antennas, so I didn't have any sort of shark fin antennas or dipoles or anything else going. It just straight up, just the 2 little whip antennas on the receiver itself. So not a lot going on there. And then I did also have a case where one of the talent leaned back against a car. I was probably, I want to say 30 to 40 yards away. We were doing an establishing shot where a car drove up and one of the talent was already there at their car, leaning back against it. And in that case, we did drop for a couple seconds there too, kind of in and out for a second when they leaned right back up against the car. So that's the only other time I've had issues with that. Otherwise, it's been super solid. And when I did the distance test, I was easily able to get 100 meters as well, just basic line of sight. And when I say line of sight, not technically line of sight, a lot of the 2.4 gigahertz and even like the AVX system, which is I think 1.9 gigahertz, a lot of those tend to fall off even when, like, for example, if you have someone 50 yards away, they're facing you, and the transmitter body pack is on their back, attached to their belt or whatever. Those systems have a tendency to fall off. Even just the barrier of a body is too much to transmit through. Where I haven't found that with the Audio Limited. So, all right, next question from Andre. How do you get the audio back to DaVinci Resolve from RX8? You save the file, and it saves it into DaVinci Resolve. So it bounces it out, and then it makes a new layer within DaVinci Resolve. So it's that simple. You'll notice here, let's come back over here to our screen. So if I actually do a round trip with Audition, I'll usually get a send back button on the tab up here. We don't get that with this, but if I just file, save, and then we'll come back into Resolve, our changes are already represented there. So you can see that there. And if I think, let's go here. And I believe if I show audio track layers, yes, it puts it as a new layer. So the cool thing is you actually have the old original audio there too. And if you're not familiar with this feature in DaVinci Resolve, it's pretty cool. Basically, whatever layer's on top is the active layer and the one that plays back in the mix. And you can have multiple layers that you can switch in between. And the nice thing about this is if you have a poly wave file with a lavalier and a boom mic, you can just kind of swap them back and forth, depending on which one sounds better. So even if I do cuts along the way here, I can drag the lavalier up for the parts that sound better on the lavalier and drag the boom mic up for the ones that sound better on the boom. So whichever layer is on top is the one that actually plays back. So that's how you get back into DaVinci Resolve. Just click File Save in RX. All right. Would you consider room tone a sound effect or dialogue? I would consider it neither. I would consider it an ambiance. So I guess it's more in the category of a sound effect, but a lot of times sound effects are specific actions. Then there's Foley, which are particular, like body movement kind of things and other props. Sound effects are usually going to be, jet engines and other things that you're going to paste in like that. And then there's ambiances, and ambiances are just kind of room tone, and if you're outdoors, whatever ambiance you've recorded there. So kind of different categories in my mind. Clayton also asks, I'm doing my first mix. I have found videos that suggest how loud dialogue and sound effects should be. However, I have not found any information on loudness of music in mixes. Well, Clayton, I would actually think of loudness as more of an integrated measurement as opposed to a measurement of individual tracks. So really, when you're mixing, you're just doing that by ear. That's all about, what makes sense. Where should the dialogue sit in relation to the music or the other sound effects? What sounds natural? What conveys the artistic intent of the piece? That's what you're aiming for. And then as a last step, once you've bounced out your final mix, then you adjust the overall loudness to whatever target you're trying to do. So if you're trying to go to web, you can see that other people disagree with me. Some say, and YouTube in particular says, and actually all of the music streaming services now, Spotify, I believe Apple Music, they're all targeting -14 LUFS these days. For me, for spoken word dialogue, that just gets a little too crunchy. Like you've pushed too much of the dynamic range out of it, and it doesn't sound great to me, and I don't like to go that hot. So I usually aim for -16 or -17. But that's just my personal preference. So you can do whatever you prefer. But that's what I found here so far. All right, next up from Richard's World Traveler. What is good range for noise floor, noise to peak dB of voice? I guess that is called dynamic range for YouTube videos or podcasts. Well, typically my kind of rule of thumb, and this is just a personal thing, is I like to usually see the noise floor sit below -60 dB full scale on the final piece. That's just what I aim for. Most people it's not going to be super distracting if it's sitting at that level or lower. That's usually what I aim for. All right, Greg also asked, so far as wireless transmitter pack placement do you have a favorite position? Ankle, waist, thigh? No, I guess. Good question. I haven't done a lot of ankle. I've done mostly waist and thighs. Usually for women, it's going to be on a thigh if they're wearing a kind of a form-fitting dress. I did the Army Nurse piece last year, and we ended up putting that on her thigh. So the idea is you have a thigh strap that has a pocket for the transmitter. You have the transmitter is in there upside down, so the antenna is facing down. That worked out pretty nicely. A lot of corporate pieces, we don't bother with getting underneath clothing. We're just putting it on the on the belt of the people. Ankles will be pretty common for men, because typically they're wearing slacks or pants of some sort, and it's pretty easy to hide it down at the ankle. So that's where you're going to see that more commonly. That's going to be much more in narrative pieces as it is versus a lot of the other pieces. For the Army nurse, the male characters, one of them was a doctor, and that was easy just to, for ease. We never saw his back, so I just put it on his back at the waist. And then for there was a private that had several lines of dialogue, and in his case, I talked to him and said, what would be most comfortable for you, and he ended up opting to put it on his waist as well. And in case of his wardrobe, that wasn't a problem because it was pretty bulky. It's kind of army. He had this army jacket, and it was easy to hide it under there without a problem. So that's what we ended up doing there as one example. So I think those are my kind of general approaches for corporate. It's almost always going to be at the waist. Thigh is generally going to be for women with dresses that are, especially if they're form-fitting dresses, because it's easy to hide there. And then for men, if I were doing more scripted work, I'd probably go with the ankle a little bit more often. All right. Next question. Okay. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're just about at the top of the hour. Well, I just want to say thanks to everybody for submitting your questions. I know some of the answers weren't necessarily super insightful yet. For those that did submit the questions in regards to music, we're working on some things here. Hopefully we'll have a very special guest in the next couple of weeks here that can share some of their experience, which is much more in-depth than what I have as far as recording and mixing music. So we're looking forward to that. All right. I think that'll do it for this week. Get out there and make some great sound, and we'll talk to all of you again really soon. Take care, everybody.